Somewhere in prehistoric Europe, long before written names, long before kingdoms, long before anyone thinks of ancestry as something hidden inside the body, a child opens their eyes and carries a colour the world has almost never seen. Around that child are faces shaped by hunger, cold smoke river valleys, animal hide, stone tools and seasons that decide who survives. The people nearby do not know they are looking at a mutation. They do not know that a tiny change in the machinery of the inheritance has altered the way light moves through an iris. They only see a pair of eyes that seem unusually pale, strange against the human norm, not blue like paint or sky exactly, but lighter, clearer, different enough to be noticed. For most of human history, eyes are dark. Brown eyes are not an exception. They are the ancient rule. They belong to people moving across Africa through the Levant into Asia, along coasts over grasslands and into the colder edges of the world. Dark irises hold more melanin, and melanin is one of the body's old protections, a pigment tied to sunlight glare and the deep evolutionary past. The first humans who leave Africa do not carry a gallery of eye colours as modern populations do. They carry variation, certainly, but the broad human story begins under dark eyes looking across bright landscapes where the sun is not gentle, and then much later in a population already far from humanity's African birthplace something changes. It is not a grand transformation. No mountain breaks open, no star appears. No tribe wakes to discover that human nature has been rewritten overnight. It is smaller than dust, smaller than a scratch on bone, smaller than the point of a stone blade. A mutation occurs near a gene involved in pigment production, and this mutation does not create blue pigment. That is the first strange thing. Blue eyes are not blue because the iris contains blue dye. They are blue because of structure light and reduced melanin because the eye becomes a living surface where light scatters and returns to the observer in a particular way. What survives in the record suggests that this trait may trace back to a shared ancient source, perhaps one ancestral mutation carried forward through generations. Scholars still debate the exact time, place and pathway of its rise, but the broad outline is astonishing enough. A small genetic change appears, survives and spreads until millions of people, thousands of years later, inherit its echo. A feature that may have begun in one family, one band, one narrow human line, becomes visible across continents. It becomes ordinary in some places, rare in others, admired, mythologized, misunderstood, and sometimes burdened with meanings it never earned. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Because the story of blue eyes is not just about beauty or genetics. It is about migration, chance desire, climate, ancient death, and the strange way a tiny accident can outlive empires. Imagine the first carriers of this trait moving through a hard landscape. The ground is not the Europe of tourist postcards. It is a continent of forests, marshes, open steppe, glacial scars, dangerous winters and animals larger than memory tends to allow. People live close to the edge of what their bodies can endure. They know tracks in mud, the behaviour of deer, the smell of wet ash, the silence before snow. Their lives are built around kinship and movement. Every child matters. Every birth is a risk. Every unusual feature is noticed because small communities notice everything. Yet noticing is not the same as understanding. No one sees genes. No one knows inheritance as chemistry. They know only resemblance. A child has the eyes of a mother, the hands of an uncle, the hair of a distant grandparent. If pale eyes appear, then appear again in another generation. The pattern may feel like family mystery, not biology. Perhaps it is ignored. Perhaps it becomes memorable. Perhaps it gives someone an unforgettable face in a world where faces are identity, memory, and survival. The evidence remains incomplete because soft human features rarely fossilize. Bone can tell us age, injury, diet, ancestry, sometimes disease. Teeth can hold chemical traces of childhood landscapes. Ancient DNA, when it survives, can whisper about pigment. But the living expression of a face disappears quickly. The first blue-eyed person leaves no portrait. Their gaze is gone. There is no carved image labeled with wonder, no preserved story from those who saw them. The mystery has to be reconstructed backward from genomes, from burial sites, from patterns in living populations, from fragments recovered out of cold earth and old bone. And that is what makes the story so powerful. Blue eyes feel immediate. They are intimate, visible, personal. Yet their origin lies in a world almost unreachable to imagination. This is a trait people now notice in mirrors, photographs, families, strangers, on trains, actors, on screens. But behind it stands a prehistoric chain of survival children who lived long enough to have children families that did not vanish, groups that moved and mixed disasters, that spared some lines and erased others. No single explanation fully accounts for why the trait spread as it did. Natural selection may have played a role. Sexual selection may have mattered. Population bottlenecks, migration, and random chance almost certainly shape the path. The colour survives not because history had a plan, but because history rarely does. In the beginning, then, blue eyes are not a symbol. They are not a race, not a destiny, not a mark of superiority, not a mythic inheritance from lost civilizations. Those ideas come much later, and many of them are wrong or dangerous. At the beginning, there is only a mutation moving through human bodies carried by people who hunt, gather, mourn, make tools, bury their dead, and watch the weather. There is only a small alteration in pigment regulation, and a world large enough for that alteration to become a story. The first blue-eyed child does not know they are unusual in any historical sense. They wake hungry. They cling to warmth. They learn faces by firelight. Their eyes reflect flame, snow water, and the dark pupils of everyone around them. The people who love them do not know that far in the future scientists will study ancient DNA and trace the possible ancestry of that colour through vanished populations. They do not know that artists, poets, rulers, and ordinary families will attach meanings to those eyes. They do not know that one day blue eyes will become a clue in one of the strangest investigations into the human past. They simply live, and somehow against all the brutal odds of prehistory, the mutation lives with them. Long before pale eyes appear in the story, humanity looks out at the world through darker irises. This is not a minor detail of appearance. It is part of a much older relationship between the human body and sunlight, one written into skin, hair, eyes, and the slow movement of people across the planet. The earliest chapters of human evolution unfold under strong sun, in landscapes where light is not only warmth, but pressure. It pours over open ground, reflects from water, and stone burns. The skin strains vision and shapes the chemistry of survival. In that world, melanin is not decoration. It is an ancient shield. Brown eyes contain more melanin in the iris, especially in the front layer where pigment absorbs and controls incoming light. This does not mean brown-eyed people are invulnerable to glare or damage, and it does not mean eye color alone decides survival. Human biology is never that simple. But darker pigmentation belongs to a broader pattern, found in populations shaped for countless generations under intense ultraviolet radiation. The body learns through inheritance, not intention. Traits that help protect tissue, preserve folate, manage sunlight, and reduce certain risks can become common because those who carry them leave descendants. What survives in the record suggests that early modern humans were not a pale, light-eyed people waiting to diversify. They were overwhelmingly people of darker pigmentation moving through bright worlds. Their eyes watch the first long migrations. They see coastlines that no longer exist because sea levels have risen and swallowed them. They see grasslands where deserts now lie rivers that have changed course, forests that expanded and retreated with the climate. They look across Africa, then beyond it into the Middle East, South Asia, Southeast Asia, Australia, Europe, and the far north. With every migration, human bodies meet new pressures, but they do not change instantly. Evolution is patient, uneven, and sometimes strangely indifferent. A population can carry old traits into new lands for thousands of years before new variations become common, and some changes spread not because they are perfectly adapted, but because the people carrying them happen to survive. This matters because the modern map of human appearance can mislead the imagination. It is easy to look at present-day Europe and assume that light skin, light hair, and light eyes have always belonged together as if they formed one ancient package. Ancient DNA has complicated that picture. Some early European hunter-gatherers appear to have carried combinations that would surprise many people today: darker skin than many modern Europeans, sometimes with blue or light eyes. Other populations carried lighter skin variants without necessarily having blue eyes. The familiar modern combinations emerged through a long process of mixing selection and demographic change. The evidence remains incomplete, but it is already enough to show that prehistory did not arrange human faces according to modern expectations. In the deeper world before those mixtures, the brown eye is simply the human eye in its most widespread ancestral form. It belongs to families making stone points beside rivers, to mothers carrying infants through heat and dust, to hunters reading faint movement in grass, to children learning which plants cut the mouth and which can be eaten. Their lives are not primitive in the sense of being simple. They are complex, skilled, and intensely observant. Survival requires knowledge so detailed that a modern person dropped into the same landscape would likely be helpless. The eye is part of that knowledge. It measures distance, recognizes tracks, sees ripeness, fear, illness, anger, kinship. Long before eye color becomes a symbol, eyes are instruments of survival. There is a lesser-known truth here that overturns many casual assumptions. Blue eyes are not the natural opposite of brown eyes. They are a reduction, a shift in pigment expression, a change in how much melanin is placed in a particular part of the iris. The basic human system is already present. The mutation that later produces blue eyes does not invent a new organ or add a new color substance. It alters regulation. It changes degree. The difference that people experience as dramatic, memorable, even beautiful, begins as a subtle adjustment in biological instructions. Human beings are often moved by surfaces, but evolution works beneath them. Brown eyes also remind us that ancestry is not a ladder leading from dark to light, or from old to new, or from simple to complex. That false idea has haunted the study of human variation for centuries. In reality, dark pigmentation is not a leftover from an unfinished past. It is one of humanity's most successful inheritances. It protected bodies across vast regions and remains adaptive in many environments. Light eyes did not replace dark eyes because they were universally better. They spread strongly only in certain populations and under certain historical conditions. No single explanation fully accounts for this, and any story that treats one color as the goal of human evolution is not science, but mythology wearing scientific clothing. The ancient world of brown eyes is also a world of immense human diversity that often goes unseen because pigment attracts attention. People differ in height, build, immunity, metabolism, smell, endurance, fertility, and countless invisible traits. Some adaptations help digest certain foods. Some alter resistance to disease. Some affect how the body responds to cold altitude or hunger. Eye colour is only one visible thread in a much larger fabric, and for most of the story it is not the most important one. Yet because it is visible, it becomes one of the easiest for later cultures to notice, classify, exaggerate and misunderstand. As modern humans push into colder and darker regions, they carry with them not only genes but culture. Clothing, fire, shelter, cooperation tools and knowledge buffer the body from the environment. This is one reason human evolution is so difficult to reduce to simple climate stories. A body does not meet the world naked and alone. It meets the world through technology and community. A group can survive in a harsh place because of sewing needles, shared food, seasonal memory and social bonds, not only because of a pigment variant. Scholars still debate how much northern environments directly encouraged lighter pigmentation and how much later population history did the work. The answer is probably not one clean cause, but a braided pattern. Still, the movement into northern latitudes changes the stage. Winters lengthen, sunlight weakens, diets shift. The sky sits lower. Snow and water create different kinds of glare. Human groups become smaller, more scattered, sometimes isolated for generations. In such conditions, rare traits can drift. A mutation that might remain nearly invisible in a large population can become noticeable in a smaller one. If the carriers survive, if their children survive, if their descendants happen to be part of expanding groups, the trait can move from accident to pattern. This is one of the quiet engines of prehistory, not destiny, but uneven survival. So before the blue-eyed mutation can become famous, the older world must be understood. It is a world where humanity is already ancient, already intelligent, already scattered across astonishing distances. It is a world where brown eyes have watched volcanoes darken skies. Glaciers advance, coastlines drown, and animals disappear. They have watched fires lit in caves and shelters, watched the dead placed carefully into the ground, watched children born during storms and migrations. The later appearance of blue eyes does not mark the beginning of anything human. It marks a variation inside a story already vast, and that is why the mutation is so strange. It arrives not at the dawn of humanity, but deep inside an ongoing human experiment. It enters a species already shaped by sunlight, memory, and movement. It appears against the background of dark irises that have carried people through almost every landscape on Earth. To understand why blue eyes mattered and why their spread still puzzles science, it is necessary first to see the world. They entered a world where the human gaze was mostly brown, and where the rarest colours had not yet begun their long rise into history. When the Ice Age begins to loosen its grip on Europe, it does not leave behind a gentle continent. It leaves a wounded one. Glaciers retreat slowly from the north, dragging stone-grinding valleys, feeding rivers swollen with meltwater. Vast plains that once supported mammoths, horses, reindeer, and bison begin to change. Open steppe gives way unevenly to birch pine, hazel oak, and deepening forest. The air warms, but warmth does not mean ease. It means old hunting grounds vanish. It means herds move differently. It means people whose ancestors survived in cold refuges must learn new maps, new animals, new seasons, and new dangers. Into this changing world come the faces that ancient DNA has made unexpectedly vivid. For a long time, people imagine Ice Age Europeans as early versions of modern Northern Europeans, pale skin, pale hair, pale eyes wrapped in furs beneath grey skies. The truth appears stranger. Some Mesolithic hunter-gatherers in Western and Northern Europe likely had relatively dark skin pigmentation, combined with light eyes, including blue or blue-like eyes. This combination feels surprising only because modern categories have trained people to expect traits in certain bundles. Prehistory refuses to obey those expectations. In the forests after the Ice Age, a person could look out from a dark-skinned face with pale eyes, carrying a genetic mixture that does not fit neatly into later myths. This is one of the great revelations of ancient DNA. The past did not look exactly like the present arranged in older clothing. It had its own human faces, its own vanished combinations, its own living possibilities. The evidence remains incomplete because pigmentation prediction from ancient genomes is not the same as seeing a person alive in daylight. Genes suggest probabilities, not portraits painted with certainty. Still, the pattern is strong enough to unsettle old assumptions. Blue eyes did not wait for fully modern European light skin to appear. In some ancient groups, light eyes may have been present before the skin-lightening variants that later became common across much of Europe had spread widely. These hunter-gatherers live in a continent of water, wood smoke and movement. They follow rivers not as borders but as roads. They camp near lakes where fish flash beneath cold surfaces. They gather hazelnuts, berries, roots, eggs and shellfish. They hunt red deer in forests so dense that older Ice Age strategies no longer work the same way. Their tools become smaller and sharper, suited to arrows, composite weapons and flexible lives. Dogs may already share their camps in some places, carrying their own ancient partnership with humans into the new age. A face with blue eyes in such a world is not a royal face, not an exotic face in the modern sense, but a local face, a familiar face, one among families who know the sound of paddles, antler tools and winter hunger. The presence of pale eyes among some post-Ice Age foragers raises a difficult question. If blue eyes were already present in these groups, why did they not simply become common everywhere at once? The answer lies in the unevenness of population history. Europe after the Ice Age is not one people. It is a shifting mosaic of groups separated by distance ecology, language, marriage networks and chance. Some bands remain small, some disappear, some merge, some leave few descendants in later populations. A trait can be common in one ancient group and still fail to dominate the future if that group is later absorbed or replaced by others. History is not a museum preserving every variation equally. It is a storm of survival lines. There is a lesser-known detail hidden in this period. Some of the most famous ancient individuals recovered from Europe do not fit comfortable stereotypes. Genomes from Mesolithic remains have suggested combinations such as dark hair, dark skin and blue eyes in individuals from regions that are now associated with very different appearances. These are not curiosities on the edge of the story. They are warnings. They tell us that the visible map of today is a recent arrangement compared with the deep age of human movement. The faces of the Ice Age's aftermath are not primitive drafts of modern nations. They are lost populations in their own right. The world around them keeps changing. As forests expand, animals that once dominated open grasslands decline or move. Sea levels rise and drown ancient coasts where people likely lived for generations. Lands that connected Britain to continental Europe begin to vanish beneath water. The North Sea covers what was once a low-inhabited plain. Rivers become estuaries. Campsites disappear under silt and tide. In such a world, the archaeological record is biased toward what happened to survive above water in caves in sheltered soils, in places not erased by later farming, building or erosion. What survives in the record suggests a rich human world, but also reminds us how much is missing. These missing pieces matter for the story of blue eyes. If the mutation spread through small groups living near coastlines now underwater, much of its early path may be gone. If it moved through marriage networks that left no obvious material signature, archaeology alone might never see it. If it rose in one region and expanded through people who left only scattered bones, Ancient DNA may catch glimpses but not the full journey. Scholars still debate where the decisive rise occurred, because the evidence appears in fragments separated by geography and time. Each new genome can sharpen the picture, but also complicate it. In the forested Europe of these hunter-gatherers, eye colour may have meant little beyond recognition. A pale-eyed person may have been memorable in a small community, but there is no need to imagine elaborate rituals around it. Prehistoric people were not blank minds waiting to turn every feature into myth. They lived practical lives, and practical lives leave limited room for modern fantasies. Yet humans are also social animals intensely aware of faces. A rare trait can become part of attraction identity or family memory without becoming a formal symbol. The evidence cannot tell us how people felt when they saw pale eyes across a fire. It can only tell us that such eyes existed, and that the people who carried them survived long enough to leave traces in the genetic record. Their survival, however, is not the same as permanence. Europe's hunter-gatherer world is about to meet a new force moving from the southeast farming. It will bring domesticated wheat, barley, sheep, goats, cattle, pottery, houses, new diseases, new social structures, and a different relationship with land. The farmers will not simply replace every forager, nor will they blend evenly everywhere. The process will be slow, tense, creative, and sometimes violent, but it will reshape ancestry across the continent. Some forager lines will persist strongly in certain regions, especially in the north and east. Others will fade into mixed populations. Traits will be shuffled again. The pale eyes of Ice Age and post-Ice Age Europe therefore stand at a crossroads. They are ancient but not yet fully triumphant. They belong to people who have survived cold, warming forest expansion, drowning coastlines and vanishing animals. They show that blue eyes are not merely a byproduct of the later Europe familiar from history books. They are older, stranger, and tangled with populations whose appearance would surprise modern observers. But their future is uncertain. A mutation can exist for thousands of years without becoming widespread. It needs carriers, descendants, and historical openings. It needs chance to keep choosing the same fragile thread. And in the long silence after the glaciers, that thread is still moving. The secret of blue eyes is not hidden in the blue. That is the part that misleads the mind first. When people look at a blue iris, they often imagine a pigment, some pale substance, placed there by the body like colour on a painted surface. But the human iris does not contain blue pigment in the ordinary sense. There is no blue dye stored in the eye, no tiny reservoir of sky-coloured material. What exists instead is a change in melanin, a change in how light enters, scatters, and returns. The colour people see is partly an optical effect, a visible consequence of absence. At the centre of the story is a region of DNA connected to the regulation of pigmentation, especially involving the HERC2 and OCA2 genes. OCA2 plays an important role in melanin production. HERC2 contains a regulatory region that can influence how strongly OCA2 is expressed in the iris. In simple terms, one small change near this system can reduce the amount of brown pigment placed in the front layer of the iris. The eye does not become blue because something blue is added. It appears blue because less melanin allows light to scatter within the iris tissue, much as short wavelengths of light scatter in the atmosphere. The comparison is useful though imperfect. A blue eye is not a little sky, but it does share with the sky a dependence on light and structure rather than blue pigment. This is why blue eyes can shift in appearance. They may seem grey in one light bright blue in another, darker near the edge, pale near the pupil. Infants can appear to have lighter eyes that later darken as melanin increases. Adults with blue eyes may show variation depending on clothing, weather, pupil size, and surrounding colours. The eye is not a fixed jewel. It is living tissue, responsive and layered. The color people assign to it is a human category placed over a biological gradient. The mutation most often associated with blue eyes does something subtle but powerful. It acts almost like a dimmer switch rather than a broken machine. Melanin production is not eliminated across the whole body. If it were, the result would be very different and far more medically significant. Instead, this regulatory change mainly affects pigment in the iris. That is why many people with blue eyes still have brown, black blonde or red hair and skin tones shaped by other genes. Pigmentation is controlled by many parts of the genome. Eye color may feel like one trait, but biologically it emerges from many interacting instructions with one particular switch, playing an especially important role in the classic blue-eyed pattern. What survives in the record suggests that many blue-eyed people today share a related version of this regulatory change, pointing to a common ancestral origin. This does not mean every person with blue eyes descends from one famous individual in the simple way popular articles sometimes imply. Human ancestry branches and recombines too much for that. But it does suggest that a key mutation arose once, or at least became widespread from a narrow source, and then travelled through a descendants over thousands of years. Scholars still debate the exact location and date of that rise, because genetic signals are blurred by migration population replacement and incomplete sampling from ancient remains. The surprising part is not merely that a mutation occurred. Mutations happen constantly. Every generation carries new changes, most of them invisible, many of them neutral, some harmful, a few occasionally useful or socially favoured. The surprising part is that this particular mutation did not vanish. In a small prehistoric population, a rare trait can easily disappear if its carriers leave no children, or if a disease, famine, conflict, winter accident, or simple bad luck cuts the line short. The first carriers of reduced iris melanin must have survived through a chain of ordinary dangers so long and fragile that it is almost impossible to imagine. A child lives, that child grows, that adult has children. Some of them inherit the trait. The pattern repeats, the mutation remains. There is quiet drama in that. Genetics can sound cold like a map of letters and switches, but every gene that survives deep time passes through bodies under pressure. It passes through childbirth, infection, hunger, migration, grief, and choice. A regulatory change near HERC2 survives because real people carry it through real landscapes. It does not float through history as an abstract code. It moves in blood, milk, bone, desire, and family. For a long time before modern genetics, people tried to explain eye color through simpler inheritance rules. Brown was often taught as dominant and blue as recessive, as if human eyes followed a tidy classroom chart. There is some truth in the old model because two blue-eyed parents usually have children with light eyes, and brown pigment often masks lighter variants. But the full reality is more complex. Multiple genes influence melanin levels, iris structure, and subtle shades. Green, hazel, grey, and mixed eyes do not fit neatly into a single switch. Eye color inheritance is predictable in broad patterns, but not perfectly simple. No single explanation fully accounts for every family surprise. This complexity matters because it protects the story from becoming too neat. Blue eyes are not a magical mutation that suddenly creates a separate people. They are one visible outcome of a broader pigment system. The same genome that shapes eye color also carries thousands of other histories, most of them invisible. A person with blue eyes may share that trait with someone across a continent, while sharing far less ancestry overall than with a brown-eyed neighbour. Visible traits can exaggerate imagined difference. Genetics often reveals the opposite human populations are tangled, overlapping, and repeatedly mixed. The mutation also shows how powerful regulatory DNA can be. Not all important genetic changes alter the structure of a protein directly. Some change when, where, or how strongly a gene is used. These switches can produce visible differences while leaving the rest of the system intact. In the case of blue eyes, the body still knows how to make melanin. It simply makes less of it in a specific place. A tiny change in regulation can become a feature noticed across a room, remembered in poetry, selected in attraction used in myth, and studied in laboratories thousands of years later. The evidence remains incomplete when it comes to how prehistoric people perceived this difference. Genes can reveal inheritance. They cannot reveal the first moment someone leaned closer to a fire and noticed that another person's eyes caught the light differently. They cannot tell whether pale eyes were admired, ignored, distrusted, or simply accepted as one of many family variations. But the biological mechanism is clear enough to strip away later fantasies. Blue eyes are not supernatural. They are not proof of hidden civilizations. They are not a mark of purity. They are a reduction of melanin shaped into color by light. And still the simplicity of that mechanism does not make the story smaller. It makes it stranger. A few altered instructions near a pigment gene change the appearance of millions of faces. A slight reduction in brown melanin created a color that has carried enormous cultural weight. Something that begins as chemistry becomes identity. Something that begins as less pigment becomes more meaning than it can safely hold. So the mutation behind blue eyes is both ordinary and extraordinary. Ordinary because it belongs to the natural churn of human variation, the constant small editing of life. Extraordinary because this one edit became visible, memorable, and historically persistent. It survived not in a fossil alone, not in a tool or a monument, but in the living gaze of descendants. Long after the first carriers disappear into Earth, long after their camps rot into soil, long after their languages vanish without a trace, the light-scattering consequence of that tiny genetic change remains. As the blue-eyed mutation moves through ancient populations, it enters landscapes where light behaves differently from the bright ancestral worlds of humanity's earliest chapters. Northern Europe is not simply colder. It is dimmer for long stretches of the year tilted toward long winters. Low sun, heavy cloud, wet forests, snow glare and summers that feel almost feverishly alive because they are so brief. The sun does not vanish, but it changes character. It arrives at a slant. It lingers near the horizon. It disappears early. It returns slowly after months when firelight, moonlight, and reflected snow may shape human vision as much as noon. This environment has often been used to explain lighter pigmentation. The idea is tempting because it seems intuitive. In places with weaker ultraviolet radiation, the body can afford to reduce some pigmentation, and lighter skin may help produce vitamin D under lower sunlight. For skin, this explanation has strong support, though even there the story is complicated by diet, clothing, migration, and culture. For blue eyes, the case is less certain. Scholars still debate whether eye color itself offered any meaningful survival advantage in northern latitudes, or whether it spread mostly through sexual selection, population history, and chance. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for the pattern. Still, the landscape matters because evolution never happens in empty space. Imagine a winter settlement beside a frozen lake. Smoke hangs low under the trees. The sun rises late and weak, turning ice into dull metal. People move carefully through snow packed by repeated footsteps. Their world is not dark in the simple sense. It is full of difficult light, glare off snow shadow under branches, flicker from fire, reflection from water, long twilight, sudden brightness after storms. In such conditions, eyes are constantly adjusting. Yet whether blue eyes help or hinder in that world is not obvious. Lighter irises may emit more scattered light and can be more sensitive to brightness. Darker irises may offer better protection from glare. Human experience varies and biology rarely gives one simple answer. Some have suggested that lighter eyes could have been useful in northern environments with low light, perhaps improving vision in dim conditions. This remains uncertain. Eye performance depends on many structures beyond iris colour, and the pupil, retina, and brain do most of the hard work. Others have argued that blue eyes may carry disadvantages in strong sunlight, because reduced iris pigment can increase light sensitivity. Modern medical studies sometimes link lighter eyes with certain risks, but translating modern health patterns directly into prehistoric survival is dangerous. Ancient people lived different lives, died from different causes, and faced pressures that do not map neatly onto present-day statistics. What survives in the record suggests that environmental adaptation alone cannot explain the distribution of blue eyes. If weak sunlight were the full answer, blue eyes might be expected to appear consistently wherever humans live at high latitudes, but they do not. Many northern and Arctic populations traditionally have dark eyes. They survive in low-light environments, through culture, diet, clothing, shelter, and biological adaptations unrelated to blue irises. This is a crucial clue. It means that the northern sky may be part of the story, but it cannot be the whole story. The mutation spread strongly in particular ancestral networks, not simply in every cold or dim place. The environment may have shaped the stage without writing the script. In small northern populations after the Ice Age, genetic drift could become powerful. Drift is the quiet force of chance, especially in small groups. A trait does not need to be useful to become more common. It can rise because a few carriers happen to have many descendants, because a group expands, because another group collapses, because a famine spares one valley and not another. In a large population, chance is often diluted. In a small population, chance can become history. Blue eyes may have benefited from this uneven arithmetic of survival. Yet humans are not passive particles drifting through climate. They choose mates, form alliances, remember faces, and notice rarity. A rare eye colour in a small community could become socially meaningful without providing any direct environmental advantage. It might be admired because it is unusual. It might be associated with a particular family. It might stand out during courtship. It might simply become more common through preference repeated over generations. This possibility leads into sexual selection, but even before that, the landscape gives such preferences room to matter. Isolated groups, small populations, and repeated local marriage patterns can magnify subtle choices. There is also a deeper connection between light and perception. Blue eyes are not always dramatically blue. In low northern light, they can appear grey, pale green silver, or almost colourless. Around firelight, they may catch warmth and shadow. Against snow, they may seem brighter. In forest shade, they may look muted and cold. The same iris changes with the world around it. That shifting quality may have made the trait visually striking in certain environments, not because it improved survival, but because it made faces memorable. Ancient people had no mirrors in the modern sense, but they had water-polished stone and above all one another. Human appearance is mostly seen socially through the eyes of other people. The climate itself keeps changing. The early Holocene brings warmer conditions, but not stability in any modern sense. Forests expand, then shift. Wetlands form. Coastlines drown. Sudden cold events interrupt the warming. The famous 8.2 kiloyear climate event brings a sharp cooling pulse that affects parts of the northern hemisphere. Communities must adjust again. In such periods, population sizes can shrink, merge, or move. Traits carried by small groups may be lost or carried into new regions. The history of blue eyes is tied to these demographic currents, even when eye color itself has nothing to do with climate survival. This is the part of the story where caution is necessary. It is easy to turn environment into destiny. It is easy to say that blue eyes evolved because northern people needed them, and to leave the sentence there clean and satisfying. But clean explanations often fail in prehistory. The spread of a trait may involve several forces at once. A mutation appears, a population bottleneck preserves it, mate preference amplifies it, migration carries it, later mixing reshapes it, and only afterward do people invent cultural meanings around it. The evidence does not allow one dramatic cause to stand alone. What can be said is this blue eyes rose in a world where the relationship between people and light had changed. The descendants of sun-adapted ancestors were living under lower skies in smaller groups across forests and northern plains, where winter controlled movement and memory. Their bodies were also changing in other ways, especially as diets shifted and later farming spread. Skin pigmentation, eye pigmentation, immune genes, metabolism and ancestry were all being reshuffled. The blue-eyed mutation did not move through a frozen museum. It moved through restless human populations responding to landscapes that refused to stay still. So light may have mattered, but not as a simple command. The northern world did not demand blue eyes. It allowed them, perhaps favoured them indirectly, perhaps made them noticeable, perhaps gave small carrier populations room to expand. The mutation survived inside a web of climate chance attraction and migration. It became one of those traits that feels inevitable only after it has already happened. Under that ancient sky, a pale iris is not yet a symbol of nations or legends. It is a small optical event in a human face catching weak sun's snowlight, waterlight and flame. Around it, the world is changing faster than anyone can understand. Forests close over old hunting grounds. Seas rise over old camps. New people approach from distant valleys. The colour remains fragile, carried by children through winters, through hunger, through marriages, through migrations no one records. And with every generation that survives, the mutation becomes a little less accidental, a little more rooted in the human landscape. If the northern landscape gives blue eyes a stage desire may have given them momentum. This is one of the most intriguing possibilities in the story, because it moves the explanation away from cold air, weak sunlight, and survival alone, and into the more unpredictable world of human attention. Bodies do not only survive environments, they also survive one another. They are seen, judged, remembered, preferred, avoided, chosen, and loved. A trait can spread not because it keeps a person warmer or better fed, but because it changes how others respond to them. Sexual selection is not the same as beauty in the modern sense. It is older, messier, and more practical than that. It can involve strength, health, voice, scent, skill, status, ornament, rarity, symmetry, behaviour, and countless signals that may or may not be consciously understood. In animals, it can produce peacock tails, bird songs, antlers, dances, colours, and displays that seem extravagant from a survival standpoint. In humans, sexual selection is harder to isolate because culture, kinship, survival skills, and social rules all shape mating. Still, the possibility remains a rare eye colour might have stood out in small prehistoric communities, and standing out can matter. Imagine a group where almost everyone has dark eyes, and then a few individuals carry pale ones. Their eyes catch light differently across fire, snow water, and forest shade. In a small society where every face is familiar, difference becomes memorable. It does not need to be worshipped. It does not need to become a myth. It only needs to be noticed often enough, and perhaps preferred often enough, that carriers leave slightly more descendants over many generations. Evolution can work with tiny biases. A small preference repeated in enough marriages and births can become a large pattern in time. Scholars still debate whether sexual selection played a major role in the spread of blue eyes. The evidence remains incomplete because attraction leaves few fossils. Bones do not preserve glances. Ancient DNA can show that a trait became more common, but it cannot directly show why someone chose one partner instead of another beside a river 8,000 years ago. What survives in the record suggests demographic shifts, population mixing, and possibly selection, but the emotional lives behind those patterns are mostly lost. Any confident claim that prehistoric people admired blue eyes for the same reasons modern people might is speculation. Yet the hypothesis is serious enough to consider because rarity itself can influence preference. Rarity has a strange power. In many populations, uncommon traits can become attractive precisely because they are uncommon. This is called frequency-dependent selection. In some contexts, the value of a trait may change depending on how common it is. A rare eye color could be striking when few people have it, but less striking once it becomes widespread. That does not prove blue eyes spread this way, but it offers a plausible mechanism. In a world without written records, wealth cities, or formal portraits, the human face is still a social signal. The eyes are central to that signal because humans are unusually attentive to gaze. We read direction, emotion, threat recognition, and intention through the eyes. A visible difference there is not like a hidden gene. It sits at the center of human interaction. There is a lesser-known point that complicates the idea of attraction. Blue eyes may not have spread alone. They moved through populations that also carried other traits, some visible and some invisible. If a group with blue eyes expanded because of advantages unrelated to eye color, the eyes could rise by association. A visible trait can hitchhike with ancestry. Later observers may think the visible trait caused the expansion when it merely rode along with people who expanded for other reasons. This is one reason no single explanation fully accounts for the spread. Blue eyes may have been favored in some contexts, neutral in others, and carried by chance in still others. Desire also does not operate outside social life. Prehistoric mating is not simply individual choice. It is shaped by kinship exchange alliances, obligations, conflict, and survival. A good partner may be someone who knows where to find food in winter, who can repair tools, who has relatives willing to share meat, who can endure hardship, who belongs to a trusted group. Eye color alone is unlikely to override these realities. But appearance can still play a role at the edges, especially when other qualities are equal, or when a rare feature becomes linked with a desirable family line. A mutation spreads through whole lives, not through isolated preferences. In small communities, founder effects can exaggerate this. If a respected or successful family carries blue eyes, and that family has many descendants, the trait may become locally common. Later generations may associate the color with familiarity, kinship, or even local identity. The people themselves may not think in terms of selection. They may simply marry within known networks, exchange partners between neighboring bands, and carry inherited features along those routes. Over time, what begins as a rare visual marker becomes part of the population's ordinary appearance. The idea that blue eyes changed humanity should therefore be understood carefully. They did not change humanity by making people fundamentally different. They changed humanity by becoming one of the visible traits through which people noticed difference, formed preferences, built myths, and later constructed identities. A mutation in the iris does not create civilization. It does not invent language, farming, metal, war, or religion. But it can become attached to all of them as humans begin to interpret bodies as signs. The biological change is small, the cultural consequences can be enormous. The first stages of that cultural meaning are almost impossible to recover. Perhaps pale eyes were admired in some groups and ignored in others. Perhaps they were associated with ancestors, spirits, illness, luck, or nothing at all. Perhaps no one cared beyond ordinary recognition. The evidence cannot decide. But once the trait becomes visible across enough people, it enters the human habit of storytelling. Humans rarely leave unusual appearances uninterpreted for long. A child with different eyes may be explained through resemblance, ancestry, omen, or memory. A stranger with pale eyes may be more easily marked as foreign, beautiful, frightening, or remarkable. The same feature can inspire attraction in one setting and suspicion in another. This is where the calm machinery of genetics meets the unstable machinery of imagination. Reduced melanin makes an iris appear blue. That is biology. But what humans think blue eyes mean is culture, and culture changes quickly. In one era they may be praised, in another distrusted, in one place ordinary, in another exotic. The trait itself remains physically simple, while its meanings multiply around it. That multiplication begins as soon as people begin to notice the difference. Sexual selection, if it played a role, likely worked quietly. There is no need to imagine dramatic prehistoric beauty contests or tribes choosing mates only by eye colour. More likely, if preference mattered, it acted through subtle, repeated choices. A face remembered, a feature admired, a partner favoured. Children born the colour appearing again. Across centuries, small preferences can become visible in population patterns. Across millennia, they can reshape what is considered normal. Yet desire alone cannot carry the whole burden of explanation. Blue eyes also spread through migration, demographic expansion, and mixing between ancient groups. The mutation needed people on the move, not just people being admired. It needed families to cross rivers, forests, and plains. It needed populations to meet, merge, and sometimes replace one another. Attraction may have opened doors, but history supplied the roads. And so inside the story of a strange mutation, another force begins to stir. Not cold, not sunlight, not survival in the narrow sense. The force is human attention, the dangerous, tender, unpredictable act of seeing another person and deciding that they matter. In that act, a pale iris may have gained power beyond its chemistry. It may have become memorable enough to be chosen enough to spread, and widespread enough to become part of humanity's visible inheritance. The next great change does not begin with eye colour, it begins with seeds. Across the ancient Near East communities slowly transform wild grasses into crops, wild animals into herds, temporary camps into more permanent settlements, and seasonal landscapes into fields that must be guarded, cleared, planted, and harvested. Farming is not invented in a single moment, and it is not an instant improvement over hunting and gathering. It brings more food in some conditions, but also more labour, more disease, more dependence on weather, more crowding and new forms of inequality. Yet once farming societies begin to expand, they carry with them a way of life that changes the genetic map of Europe. For thousands of years, Europe has been home to hunter-gatherer populations shaped by the Ice Age and its aftermath. Some of these groups carry light eyes, some may carry relatively dark skin. They know rivers, forests, coasts, fish runs, nut groves, animal trails, and seasonal camps. Then, from the southeast, farming populations spread gradually into the continent. They bring wheat, barley, peas, lentils, sheep, goats, cattle, pigs, pottery, polished stone axes, houses, storage pits, and a different idea of land. The forest is no longer only a place to move through and read. It becomes something to cut, burn open, and claim. The farmers do not arrive as a single wave washing cleanly across an empty map. They move in families, villages, routes, pauses, and frontiers. Some follow the Mediterranean coast by boat and shoreline. Others move inland through river valleys. They meet foragers who already live there, sometimes trading, sometimes mixing, sometimes avoiding one another, and sometimes fighting. The evidence remains incomplete because contact between worlds can leave ambiguous traces. A pot style may spread without many people moving. A tool can be copied. A burial custom can be adopted. But ancient DNA has made one thing clear. The arrival of farming brings substantial new ancestry into Europe. This matters for Blue Eyes because the farmers and foragers do not carry identical genetic histories. Early European farmers generally trace much of their ancestry to Anatolia and nearby regions. Many of them likely carry lighter skin-associated variants more commonly than older Western hunter-gatherers did, but blue eyes are not necessarily common among them in the same way. The result is a long period of mixing in which traits now imagined as naturally linked are actually being shuffled. Darker-skinned, light-eyed foragers meet lighter-skinned, darker-eyed farmers. Their descendants inherit combinations that may not match either parent population exactly. Human appearance is being remade not by one mutation alone, but by the slow blending of worlds. In some places, farming spreads quickly. In others, foragers persist for a long time on the margins in forests, wetlands, islands, northern coasts and regions less suited to early crops. The frontier is not just a line on a map. It is a living zone of curiosity and tension. Farmers may value land and stored grain. Foragers may value mobility and knowledge of wild resources. Farmers may see forests as something to clear. Foragers may see them as memory, pantry, road, and shelter. Their children, when communities mix, inherit not only genes but different ways of understanding the world. There is a lesser-known human cost to this transition. Early farmers often show signs of physical stress, crowded settlements, can spread disease, grain, heavy diets can affect teeth and health, and dependence on crops can make famine sharper when harvests fail. Farming eventually supports larger populations, but it does not always make individuals healthier at first. The old story that agriculture was simply progress has become more complicated. It is a trade, more people, more permanence, more stored food, but also more vulnerability to crop failure, infection, hierarchy, and conflict. In this changing world, genes move along with customs, but survival pressures also change. For Blue Eyes, the Neolithic does not provide a simple rise or fall. In many regions, forager ancestry declines as farming ancestry increases. If blue eyes are especially common among some forager groups, one might expect the trait to decline. But later, mixing regional persistence and future migrations prevent that from being the end of the story. Traits do not obey one demographic event. They can fade in one region, persist in another, reappear through admixture or rise later when another population carrying them expands. What survives in the record suggests that Europe's visible traits are assembled over multiple waves not delivered in one package. The first farming villages themselves create new conditions for inheritance. In a small mobile band, marriage networks may stretch across wide seasonal territories. In farming communities, people may stay closer to fields and settlements, though exchange networks still matter. Population sizes grow. Children become labor as well as kin. Stored food can support more births, though also more mouths to feed. Larger populations can dilute rare traits, but they can also preserve them across more descendants. The arithmetic of inheritance changes when villages multiply. Meanwhile, the old hunter-gatherer worlds do not simply disappear. They survive in pockets and in bloodlines. Forager ancestry later resurges in some Neolithic populations after initial farming expansions, suggesting that mixing continued over generations. This is important because it means the story was not one clean replacement. It was a long entanglement. The people of the forests and coasts did not vanish without leaving descendants. Their genetic traces entered farming communities, and with them perhaps some of the light-eye variants that had circulated among older European groups. A person born in one of these mixed communities might carry a farmer's crops and a forager's eyes, or a forager's ancestry hidden beneath a village life. They might live in a timber house, grind grain on stone-tend animals, and still inherit features from people who once moved through the same region with nets, bows, and seasonal camps. Their body becomes an archive of contact. Their face holds histories no one can read directly. This is one reason modern identity based on appearance is so fragile. A visible trait can survive through people whose cultures change completely. Blue eyes can pass from foragers into farmers, from one language world into another, from one burial tradition into another, without carrying any single culture with them. Genes do not preserve beliefs intact. They preserve biological inheritance while languages vanish, rituals transform, and names disappear. A person may inherit an eye color variant from ancestors whose way of life would be almost unrecognizable to them. The Neolithic also sets the stage for later inequality and social selection. As communities grow, some households may accumulate more animals, land, or stored goods. Marriage may become more tied to alliance and status. Certain lineages may expand more than others. If a visible trait happens to be common in a successful lineage, it can spread for reasons having little to do with beauty or climate. This is another hidden contradiction in the story. The trait people notice may not be the trait history selected. It may simply travel with power, fertility, geography, or luck. By the end of the Neolithic, Europe is no longer the continent of scattered post-Ice Age foragers, but it is not yet the Europe of later history either. It is a patchwork of farmers, mixed communities, old forager remnants, long-distance exchange networks, monuments, fields, herds, and regional traditions. Megaliths rise in some places, villages cluster in others, forests retreat and return, diseases move. People carry pottery axes, stories, and genes across landscapes that are becoming more crowded and contested. Blue eyes remain part of this shifting mosaic. They are not the main driver of history, but they move through it, sometimes rare, sometimes more common, never fully separable from the migrations carrying them. The mutation that once appeared as a fragile accident is now embedded in larger human transformations. It passes through the meeting of farmers and foragers, through the blending of diets and bodies, through marriages that join worlds and conflicts that end them. The next force will come from farther east, from open grasslands beyond the farming frontiers where people live with horses, herds, wagons, and a mobility that can redraw continents. When they arrive, Europe's ancestry will shift again. Languages may spread with them. Social structures may harden, and the visible traits of future populations, including the pale eyes that began as a small genetic change, will be carried into a new and larger storm. Far to the east of Europe's early farming villages, beyond forests and river valleys, another world is gathering strength under a wider sky. It is a world of grassland, wind herds, and long distances where horizons do not close around people the way forests do. Across the Pontic-Caspian steppe and neighbouring regions, communities learn to live with a form of mobility that changes what human expansion can mean. Cattle-sheep, goats, wagons, and eventually horses reshape movement, wealth, warfare, and connection. The steppe is not empty. It is a vast human corridor, and once people learn how to move through it at scale, it becomes one of the great engines of prehistoric change. The arrival of steppe-related ancestry into Europe during the late Neolithic and Bronze Age is one of the most dramatic shifts revealed by ancient DNA. It does not happen everywhere in the same way, and scholars still debate the details of a language power violence and cultural transmission. But the genetic signal is strong. Populations associated with steppe pastoralist horizons expand westward and mix with existing European communities. In some regions, the ancestry shift is enormous. In others, it's more gradual or uneven. What survives in the record suggests not just the movement of ideas, but the movement of many people. These newcomers do not enter a blank continent. They meet farming societies already rooted in fields, villages, monuments, and local traditions. They meet people descended from earlier farmers and older hunter-gatherers. They enter lands where forests have been cleared, where cattle graze, where graves mark territory, where exchange networks already connect distant communities. But they bring with them a different scale of mobility, and perhaps a different social order. Their dead are often buried under mounds or in single graves with distinctive customs. Their material culture points toward herding movement and status. Their genetic impact suggests that their arrival was not merely a fashion. For the story of Blue Eyes, the steppe migration matters because it reshuffles Europe once again. The modern distribution of eye colour cannot be explained only by Ice Age foragers or Neolithic farmers. It emerges after these layers combine with steppe-related populations and later regional histories. Some steppe groups likely carried alleles associated with lighter pigmentation, including variants affecting skin, hair and eye colour, though the exact frequencies varied, and the evidence remains incomplete. As they moved and mixed, they helped shape the ancestry of many later Europeans. A trait that may have existed earlier in hunter-gatherers now travels through new demographic channels. The steppe also changes the social landscape in ways that may influence which lineages expand. Ancient DNA studies have suggested that in some Bronze Age contexts, male-mediated migration was especially strong, meaning that incoming male lines contributed heavily to later populations. This is a sensitive and complex area, and no single explanation fully accounts for it. It may involve social status, warfare, alliance, disease, marriage practices, or demographic collapse among earlier groups. But the pattern matters. If certain lineages expand disproportionately, any visible traits they carry can become more common not because those traits themselves are favoured, but because the people carrying them gain reproductive reach. Imagine a farming valley at the edge of this transformation. For generations, families have lived by fields and cattle pens, burying their dead according to local customs. Then new objects appear, new burial forms, new animals used in new ways, new people with ancestry from beyond the horizon. Perhaps some arrive as traders, some as marriage partners, some as raiders, some as settlers. The archaeological record cannot always tell cleanly where exchange ends and conquest begins. The evidence is uneven and human events rarely fit neat categories. But over time the local population changes. Children are born with mixed ancestry. Old customs disappear or survive in altered form. The genetic map bends. There is lesser-known detail in this broader transformation. The steppe expansion may also be tied to the spread of Indo-European languages, though the exact pathways remain debated. Many researchers see a strong connection between steppe-related migrations and the later distribution of Indo-European language families across Europe and parts of Asia. Others emphasize complexity, multiple roots, and earlier or parallel processes. The point for this story is not to solve the language debate, but to notice how visible traits can become entangled with invisible inheritances. A person may inherit blue eyes, a pastoralist ancestor, and a language family's distant legacy, But none of these are the same thing. Genes, language, and culture travel together, sometimes then split apart. The Bronze Age world that follows is more connected and more unequal than much of what came before. Metal changes exchange. Copper, tin, and bronze link distant regions because the resources are not evenly distributed. Elites emerge in some areas marked by weapons, ornaments, wagons, horses, and rich graves. Violence becomes more visible in certain records. Fortifications appear. Trade routes stretch across mountains, coasts, and plains. In this world, ancestry can spread through power as much as through adaptation. Successful groups leave more descendants. Defeated groups may be absorbed, displaced, or reduced. The color of an iris is carried through these processes without controlling them. Blue eyes then move through an age of wheels and herds of burial mounds and bronze blades of long-distance exchange and expanding social hierarchies. They are no longer only a rare feature in small forager bands or a trace within mixed farming communities. They are part of the human variation being redistributed by some of the largest migrations in European prehistory. Their spread is not separate from the movement of cattle, wagons, languages, pathogens, and power. History does not carry traits gently. It carries them through upheaval. At the same time, it would be wrong to imagine the steppe as a simple source of blue eyes, as if the trait suddenly rides west on horseback and explains everything. The mutation is older than these movements, and light eyes appear in earlier European contexts. The steppe expansion amplifies and rearranges existing variation. It adds another layer, not the whole origin. This distinction matters because simple origin stories are seductive. They offer a single people, a single migration, a single dramatic answer. The actual evidence points to a longer and more tangled process. As steppe-related ancestry spreads, Europe's regional differences sharpen and shift. In some northern and eastern areas, light eyes become more common over time. In southern regions, darker eyes remain more frequent, shaped by different ancestry proportions. Later migrations, climate histories, and population sizes. The pattern is not a clean north-south line, but a mosaic. Mountain seas, marriage networks, farming density, and later historical events all influence it. The mutation moves through geography like ink through layered cloth, darker in some threads, faint in others, never evenly absorbed. The people living through this transformation do not understand it as genetics. They understand it as neighbours, arriving marriages, arranged graves, dug animals, traded conflicts, remembered songs, learned strangers becoming kin or enemies. A child with pale eyes born in this world may carry ancestry from foragers, farmers, and steppe pastoralists at once. Their face may contain the deep forest, the Anatolian field, and the grassland horizon, though no one around them can name those layers. The body becomes a map that culture cannot yet read. The steppe's arrival is therefore a turning point, not because it creates blue eyes, but because it helps create the populations in which blue eyes will later become familiar. It pushes Europe toward the ancestral patterns seen in many later groups. It links small local histories to continent-wide change. It shows that a visible trait can become common only when the people carrying it are caught in larger currents of expansion. By the Bronze Age, the mutation that once may have flickered in a single child has passed through ice forest farming, and now the open steppe. It has survived every reshuffling so far, but its rise is still uneven, and the central mystery remains. Why does this colour become so common in some regions while remaining rare across most of the world? The answer lies not in one migration, one climate, or one preference, but in the strange mathematics of population history, where chance and choice can look from a distance almost like fate. The more blue eyes spread, the more mysterious their spread becomes. A mutation can appear anywhere, but most mutations do not become famous. They do not become common enough to shape the appearance of whole regions. They rise briefly in one family, then vanish. They persist quietly at low levels. They are buried under the arithmetic of larger populations. Blue eyes did something different. In some parts of Europe, especially around the Baltic and northern regions, they became remarkably frequent, while across most of the world they remained uncommon or rare. That unevenness is the heart of the puzzle. If the mutation was simply useful in cold or dim climates, the map should be easier to explain. But the world refuses that simplicity. Many peoples living in northern latitudes have dark eyes. Many populations adapted to snow-low winter light and Arctic conditions did not develop high frequencies of blue eyes. If the mutation were purely a matter of attraction, then one might expect it to spread wherever people found rarity desirable, but it did not. If it were merely random drift, the extremely high frequencies in some regions still invite questions about why chance favored this trait so strongly there and not elsewhere. No single explanation fully accounts for this. The likely answer is not one cause, but a sequence. First, the mutation appears and survives in ancient populations. Then, in some small groups, chance allows it to become more common. Then those groups expand or are absorbed into larger populations. In certain environments and social networks, the trait may become noticeable and perhaps preferred. Later migrations amplify again. Over thousands of years, the combined effect looks dramatic, even if no single generation experiences anything dramatic at all. This is how prehistory often works, a vast outcome built from small, almost invisible steps. Population bottlenecks may have played an important role. A bottleneck occurs when a population shrinks sharply, or when a new population is founded by a small subset of people. If that subset happens to carry a trait at a higher frequency, the trait can become common among descendants. This does not require the trait to be useful. It only requires the carriers to be present at the right moment. In the deep past, bottlenecks could be caused by climate shifts, migration into new territory, disease, famine, isolation, or the founding of small communities. The evidence remains incomplete, but ancient Europe offers many opportunities for such events. Northern Europe after the Ice Age and later during the spread of farming and steppe ancestry contains exactly the kinds of conditions where drift can matter: small populations, regional isolation, repeated expansions from limited groups and later mixing between lineages. In one valley a trait may disappear. In another it may become common simply because the people who carry it have more surviving children. When descendants of that second group expand, the trait travels with them. To later observers, the result may look like selection. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it is luck with a long shadow. There is a lesser known but important distinction between a mutation's origin and its expansion. The place where a trait first appears is not necessarily the place where it becomes common. A spark may begin in one population and become a fire in another. Blue eyes may have originated in one ancient context, persisted in several groups, and reached high frequency only later under different demographic conditions. This is why searching for the first blue-eyed person, while fascinating, cannot answer the whole question. The origin is only the beginning. The expansion is the mystery. Ancient DNA has revealed that the genetic landscape of Europe changed repeatedly, sometimes sharply. Hunter-gatherers, early farmers, and steppe-related groups all contributed to later populations in varying proportions. Each reshuffling could alter the frequency of eye color variants. If a population with more blue-eye alleles expanded into a region where populations were smaller or declining, the trait could rise quickly. If later communities practiced marriage within relatively limited networks, the frequency could climb even more. Over time, a visible pattern emerges without needing a single dramatic moment, but selection may still have played some role. If pale eyes were socially or sexually preferred in certain groups even slightly, their frequency could increase beyond what drift alone would produce. This preference might be based on rarity, perceived attractiveness, recognition of kinship or associations with particular families. It might vary by region and period. Scholars still debate the strength of this effect because ancient genomes can suggest patterns of selection, but rarely explain the social mechanism behind them. The dead preserve DNA, not desire. Another possibility is that the blue eye mutation was linked directly or indirectly with nearby genetic variation that affected something else. Sometimes a visible trait rises because it is genetically associated with another trait under selection. This is not the most straightforward explanation for blue eyes, but it reminds us to be cautious. The genome is not a set of isolated labels. It is a landscape of linked regions, regulatory effects, and inherited blocks that recombine over time. A trait may become common for reasons partly hidden from the visible feature itself. The uneven spread also reflects the enormous size of the world beyond Europe. Most human populations had their own deep histories, large numbers, local adaptations, and marriage networks. A mutation common in one region does not automatically flow into others. Deserts, mountains, seas, social boundaries, distance, and simple demography slow movement. Brown eyes remain common globally, not because they are less evolved, but because they are the older widespread human condition, and because the blue eye mutation never became frequent in most ancestral populations. The global rarity of blue eyes is not a failure of spread. It is the normal outcome of a local mutation in a vast species. In regions where blue eyes did become common, they still did not erase variation. Hazel green, grey-brown, and mixed eyes persisted. Families carried different combinations. Local populations differed from one village, valley, coast, or island to another. The modern impression of uniformity is often exaggerated by national stereotypes. Even in Northern Europe, eye colour is not one thing. It is a spectrum shaped by many genes and many histories. The classic blue eye is only one expression within a broader field of reduced or altered pigmentation. The rapid spread then may be rapid only from the perspective of deep time. Across human lives it would have been slow. No one sees a mutation conquer a continent. They see children resemble grandparents. They see families with pale eyes become common in one district. They see strangers arrive, marry and leave descendants. They see old features fade and new ones become ordinary. What looks sudden in a genetic chart may have taken hundreds or thousands of years, long enough for every generation to experience it as normal. This is why the story resists a clean answer. Blue eyes spread through a combination of mutation, survival, drift migration, mixing possible preference, and later social history. Each force alone is insufficient. Together they form a plausible path. The trait became common not because it was destined to, but because it passed through the right sequence of human accidents. It survived the first fragile generations. It entered populations where chance could raise its frequency. It moved through migrations that reshaped Europe. It may have caught the human eye in ways that mattered. And once it became common in certain regions, it stayed there, carried forward by ordinary inheritance. The mystery of rapid spread is therefore not a mystery of magic, but of scale. Tiny causes become enormous when multiplied by time. A small mutation near a pigment gene becomes a regional signature. A few carriers become millions of descendants. A rare gaze becomes ordinary in some places and striking in others. The same colour that may once have marked a single unusual child becomes after millennia part of the human map. Yet the map is not the territory and the colour is not the person. Blue eyes tell a story, but only a narrow one. They point toward ancestry, but they do not define it. They suggest population history, but they do not reveal language, culture, intelligence, worth, or identity. They are a clue, not a verdict, and like many clues from the human past, they become most powerful when handled carefully. As blue eyes become more visible within certain ancient communities, they begin to enter the quieter world of recognition. Before they are ever written into myth, painted into portraits, praised in poetry, or misused by later ideologies, they exist in villages, camps, farms, and burial grounds, where people know one another by face. In small societies, identity is not abstract. It is carried in scars, posture, hair, voice, gait, hands, and eyes. A person is not simply one body among thousands. They are someone's child cousin, rival partner, elder debt, memory, and warning. The face is a social map. In that kind of world, an unusual eye colour may become part of kinship knowledge. It can mark a family line without anyone thinking in genetic terms. People may notice that pale eyes appear among certain siblings, or that a child resembles a dead grandmother, or that a stranger from another valley carries a look associated with outsiders. What survives in the record cannot tell us these thoughts directly, but human communities everywhere show deep attention to resemblance. Long before bloodlines are written down, they are remembered through bodies. This does not mean blue eyes create fixed identities in prehistory. That would be too strong, and the evidence remains incomplete. Eye colour alone would not define a person's place in the group. Skill, age, sex, marriage, ties, ritual knowledge, generosity, courage, and survival ability likely mattered far more. A person who could find food, calm conflict, heal wounds, shape tools, or remember migration routes had value, no matter the colour of their eyes. But visible traits can still become shorthand. They help people place one another inside stories of descent. Kinship is one of the oldest human technologies. It organizes care, inheritance, obligation, marriage, and trust. In a world without documents, kinship lives in memory. People must remember who can marry whom, who belongs to which household, which relationships are dangerous, which alliances matter, and which strangers may be accepted. A rare trait can become one thread in that memory. Not a perfect marker, not a scientific tool, but a sign people may notice and repeat. There is surprising possibility here. Blue eyes may have helped make ancestry visible in ways that mattered socially, even if only occasionally. A child with pale eyes in a mostly dark-eyed community might make hidden paternity, distant kinship, or inherited connection more noticeable. In some cases that could create pride, in others suspicion. No single explanation fully accounts for how ancient people interpreted such traits, because each community had its own rules. The same eye colour could be ordinary in one place, beautiful in another, and unsettling somewhere else. As farming and later Bronze Age societies grow more complex, visible inheritance may become more tightly bound to status. Households begin to matter differently when land animals, tools, and stored wealth can pass through families. Lineages may claim rights to fields, herds, graves, or sacred places. In such conditions, bodies become evidence in a social sense. Resemblance can support belonging. Difference can complicate it. Blue eyes are only one feature among many, but they sit in the most emotionally charged part of the face. The eye also carries another power gaze. Humans are unusually sensitive to where others are looking. The whites of human eyes make gaze direction easier to detect than in many other primates, and this helps cooperation, teaching, hunting, warning, and social reading. Eye color does not create that system, but it may affect how gaze is perceived. Pale irises can make pupil contrast more noticeable in some lighting. They can seem more exposed, more direct, or more changeable depending on context. This is partly biology and partly interpretation. Ancient people may not have described it, but they certainly lived by reading eyes. Around fires in houses at graves during exchanges between groups, eyes help measure trust. A stranger's gaze can be invitation or threat. A child's eyes can summon care. An elder's eyes can hold authority even when the body weakens. A rare colour in that gaze may become memorable because eyes already matter so much. This is where the mutation begins to move from body to meaning. It does not need written language, it only needs attention. Yet there is danger in giving too much significance to colour. Later societies often turn visible traits into boundaries sharper than reality. Prehistoric communities were probably capable of noticing difference, but their identities were not based on modern racial categories. Those categories are recent, unstable, and historically loaded. Ancient people organized themselves through kinship language, locality, subsistence, alliance, and ritual, not through the modern classifications that later centuries imposed on bodies. Blue eyes may have marked family resemblance or regional familiarity, but they did not carry the meanings later attached to them. What makes the story powerful is precisely that gap. A trait can be socially noticed long before it becomes ideological. It can pass through generations as a simple family feature, then later be lifted into myth beauty standards, ethnic symbols, or fantasies of origin. The mutation itself remains unchanged. The meanings around it grow heavier. In ancient communities, blue eyes may have helped people remember who came from where. A pale-eyed family in a village might be known as descendants of outsiders who married in generations earlier. A cluster of pale-eyed children might reflect a founder line. In regions where the trait became common, it might lose any special power and become simply normal. This changing value is important. A trait is not meaningful by itself. Meaning depends on frequency, context, and story. Burial practices offer indirect glimpses into how communities thought about belonging, though they do not reveal eye colour unless DNA survives. Some graves show care across generations with bodies placed near kin. Others show outsiders buried differently or violent deaths or unusual treatment. When ancient DNA links buried individuals by family relationship, it sometimes reveals social patterns that objects alone could not show. People buried together may be biological kin or not. Some communities emphasize ancestry, others emphasize household status or ritual role. Within these patterns, visible inheritance likely mattered, but never in isolation. Blue eyes therefore belong to a larger ancient concern: who are we and who belongs with us? This question is older than writing and older than states. It appears wherever humans share food, raise children, mourn the dead, and negotiate marriage. A mutation in iris pigmentation becomes relevant because it is inherited, visible, and memorable. It can connect generations without anyone understanding DNA. It can make the past appear in a child's face. As populations mix, the meaning of such traits becomes even more fluid. A blue-eyed person in a mixed farming community may embody several ancestries at once. Their eyes may come from one deep line, their skin tone from another, their language from a third, their tools from a fourth. No one around them separates these layers scientifically. They live as one person, one member of a community, one moving point in a much larger human web. The modern desire to assign simple origins to visible traits would have made little sense in their daily world. Still, the colour continues to travel through families. It appears in siblings, skips generations, reappears unexpectedly, clusters in some lineages, fades in others. It becomes part of household memory. People may not know why two darker-eyed parents sometimes have a lighter-eyed child, or why a grandparent's eyes return after years. They may explain it through ancestry, spirits, resemblance, or chance. The biological truth is hidden, but the pattern is visible enough to be remembered. In this way, blue eyes begin to change humanity not by altering survival alone, but by entering human social imagination. They become one of the signs through which people read descent, difference, attraction, and belonging. The change is subtle. It unfolds in glances, not monuments. But history is full of forces like that, small, intimate, repeated, until they become part of the background of civilization. Once human beings begin to build larger stories around themselves, the body becomes more than a body. Hair, scars, height, skin, eyes, and posture are pulled into systems of meaning. They become signs of beauty, danger, nobility, strangeness, divinity, foreignness, weakness, strength, or fate. None of these meanings are fixed. They change from place to place and from century to century, but they show one constant human habit. People rarely look at an unusual feature and leave it alone. They turn it into a story. Blue eyes enter this symbolic world quietly at first. In regions where they are common, they may not seem extraordinary. In regions where they are rare, they may become unforgettable. A traveller, captive, trader, bride, warrior, or stranger with pale eyes can stand out sharply in memory. The feature is visible at close range, tied to gaze and emotion, and difficult to hide. It sits at the point where identity meets attention. That makes it easy for later cultures to exaggerate. In ancient literature and art, eye colour is not always described with the precision modern people expect. Words for colour often behave differently across cultures. A term that seems to mean blue may also suggest grey, shining, pale, stormy bright, or even simply unusual. Ancient colour language is often tied to texture light, an impression rather than strict categories. This is a lesser-known problem in trying to trace blue eyes through old texts. When a source describes bright eyes, grey eyes, sea-coloured eyes, or gleaming eyes, scholars still debate what physical colour was meant, or whether the description is symbolic rather than literal. The Greeks, for example, used colour terms that do not map neatly onto modern English. A word associated with the goddess Athena is often translated as grey-eyed or bright-eyed, but its exact meaning has been debated for generations. It may refer to a grey-green brightness, an owl-like gaze, or a quality of flashing perception, rather than a simple iris colour. This uncertainty matters. Later readers may want ancient texts to confirm modern ideas about appearance, but the evidence does not always cooperate. The past speaks in its own categories. As societies become more complex, blue or pale eyes can be attached to different meanings depending on who is describing whom. Among people where light eyes are relatively common, they may be part of ordinary beauty language or family resemblance. Among people encountering pale-eyed outsiders, they may become signs of foreignness. Roman descriptions of northern peoples sometimes emphasize physical differences, including height, hair, and eyes. But such descriptions are shaped by politics, fear, admiration, and stereotype. They tell us as much about Roman imagination as about the people being described. This is where the mutation becomes culturally dangerous. A real biological variation becomes available for myth-making. It can be used to romanticize outsiders or dehumanize them. It can become a mark of barbarian vigor, divine favor, coldness, seduction, or threat. No single meaning dominates across all history. The same blue eyes can be praised in one tradition and made eerie in another. They can belong to heroes, witches, saints, enemies, lovers, foreigners, nobles, peasants, and ghosts. The colour itself does not change, the story around it does. What survives in the record suggests that people often noticed eyes because eyes already carried moral and emotional meaning. Across cultures, the eye is linked with knowledge, jealousy, blessing, curse, insight, and vulnerability. The idea of the evil eye appears in many regions, not because of blue eyes specifically, but because gaze itself is imagined as powerful. In some later Mediterranean and Middle Eastern folk traditions, blue-coloured amulets are used against the evil eye, and in certain contexts blue eyes themselves are associated with a dangerous or piercing gaze. These traditions are layered and varied, and it would be wrong to reduce them to one origin, but they reveal how easily eye colour can enter symbolic life. In medieval and later European art, blue eyes often become associated with purity, beauty, innocence, or spiritual brightness, especially when combined with pale skin and fair hair in idealized figures. But art is not a mirror of population genetics. Painters follow conventions, theology, patron taste, available pigments, and symbolic codes. A blue-eyed saint in a painting does not necessarily tell us what the historical person looked like. It tells us what the image needed to communicate. The evidence remains incomplete when art is treated as anthropology. Popular imagination later goes even further, tying blue eyes to lost races, ancient superhumans, mysterious northern origins, or invented lineages. These fringe theories are unsupported, and many are shaped by modern ideology rather than evidence. The genetic truth is more interesting and more humbling. Blue eyes are not a sign of hidden superiority or a remnant of some vanished master people. They are a regulatory mutation that spread through ordinary human populations by complex historical processes. The myths reveal human desire for meaning. The DNA reveals inheritance without moral rank. Still, myth matters because it changes how people live with traits. A feature that begins as biology can affect social experience once others interpret it. Blue eyes may influence attraction, suspicion, status, or identity, not because of the iris itself, but because of the stories attached to it. Over centuries, those stories can become deeply embedded. They appear in marriage preferences, beauty standards, portraits, literature, and casual assumptions. The mutation becomes memory, but also projection. This is one reason the history of blue eyes must be told carefully. It is easy to slip from explaining a trait into celebrating a myth. It is equally easy to dismiss the trait as meaningless and miss the real cultural weight it has carried. The truth lies between. Blue eyes are biologically simple compared with the meanings placed on them, but meanings are part of history too. They shape how people see one another, and sometimes how they treat one another. In the long arc from prehistory to written culture, blue eyes move from accident to inheritance, from inheritance to recognition, from recognition to symbolism. The first carriers could not have imagined any of this. They did not know their eyes would one day be described in poems, painted into icons, envied, exoticized, feared, idealized, and misused. They simply lived inside their own bodies. Later societies did the rest, and perhaps that is the deeper pattern. Humanity is constantly turning small biological differences into large cultural stories. Some of those stories are gentle, some are beautiful, some are false and harmful. The blue-eyed mutation did not demand any of them. It merely made light behave differently in the iris. Everything beyond that was human imagination gathering around the gaze. For most of history, the dead kept their faces to themselves. Archaeologists could lift bones from the earth, measure skulls, examine teeth, study injuries, and reconstruct diets from chemical traces, but the living colour of a person was usually gone. Skin decays. Hair rarely survives. Eyes disappear almost immediately. The most expressive part of the human face leaves almost nothing behind. A skeleton can reveal age, sex, trauma, disease, and sometimes ancestry, but it cannot look back. That silence began to change when ancient DNA turned bone into a different kind of archive. Suddenly, fragments of genetic code preserved in teeth and dense bone could speak about ancestry, kinship, disease, lactose tolerance, migration, and sometimes pigmentation. The dead did not return as portraits, but they returned as probabilities. Scientists could ask whether an ancient person likely carried variants linked to dark hair, lighter skin, or blue eyes. The results were often startling not because they created wild mysteries, but because they corrected modern assumptions. One of the most important lessons was that ancient Europeans did not all resemble modern Europeans. Some Mesolithic hunter-gatherers likely carried blue-eye variants, while also carrying pigmentation profiles suggesting darker skin than many people expected. Later, farmers brought different ancestry and different pigmentation-associated genes. Steppe-related populations added still more layers. What survives in the record suggests that the modern European face is not ancient in a simple way. It is assembled from deep mixtures. This discovery changed the story of blue eyes from speculation into investigation. Instead of guessing from modern populations alone, researchers could track the trait backward through actual ancient remains. A genome from one region could reveal a light eye allele thousands of years ago. Another genome elsewhere might show its absence. Patterns began to emerge, though never perfectly. Ancient DNA preservation is uneven. Cold climates preserve genetic material better than hot, wet ones. Some regions are heavily sampled, others remain nearly silent. The evidence remains incomplete, and every new discovery can sharpen or complicate the map. Still, the dead have already overturned the old picture. Blue eyes are not merely a recent decorative feature of historic Europe. They reach deep into prehistoric populations. At the same time, they are not evidence of some pure ancient people unchanged through time. The people who carried them lived through repeated transformations, and many ancient groups that once existed are not identical to any modern population. Ancient DNA reveals continuity but also loss. It shows ancestry surviving through mixture, not through isolation. There is a strange intimacy in this science. A tooth buried for 7,000 years can preserve enough genetic information to suggest the color of a vanished iris. The person themselves is gone beyond recovery, their voice fears, gestures, memories, jokes, and grief. But one small part of their appearance can be inferred, not seen directly, not with certainty, but approached. The result is both powerful and humbling. Science can restore clues, not souls. This is why reconstructions of ancient faces must be treated carefully. A model in a museum, a digital image, or a documentary face can feel definitive, but it is built from probabilities. Skull shape can guide structure. DNA can suggest pigmentation. Archaeology can provide clothing or context. Yet the final face is still partly interpretation. Scholars still debate details because the data are limited, and because genes do not translate into appearance with perfect precision. A reconstructed, blue-eyed hunter-gatherer is not a photograph from the past. It is an informed bridge across absence. Ancient DNA has also revealed kinship in ways no one could see from artifacts alone. People buried together are sometimes close relatives, sometimes they are not. Communities that seem culturally unified may contain diverse ancestry. Individuals buried with local customs may have been migrants. Others with foreign objects may be local. This matters for eye color because visible traits can move across cultural boundaries without leaving obvious archaeological signs. A person's eyes may tell one genetic story while their grave tells another cultural one. The science itself depends on extreme care. Ancient DNA is fragile and easily contaminated by modern handlers. Laboratories work with protective clothing, clean rooms, chemical controls, and repeated testing. Early genetic studies were sometimes vulnerable to contamination and overinterpretation, but methods have improved dramatically. Even so, uncertainty remains part of the process. Good science does not erase uncertainty. It measures it. The deeper lesson is that the human past is not arranged around modern categories. Ancient DNA has shown that people moved more often, mixed more deeply, and changed more repeatedly than older archaeological models sometimes assumed. Blue eyes are one visible thread in this movement, but they cannot be separated from the whole fabric. A light iris in an ancient skeleton may connect to a forager lineage, a mixed community, or a later migration depending on context. The colour alone never tells the full story, and yet it tells enough to matter. It shows that small mutations can outlast languages. It shows that features now treated as ordinary once belonged to strange combinations of traits lost from the living world. It shows that the human face has changed across time, not in a straight line, but through collisions, disappearances, and survivals. The dead read through DNA remind the living that ancestry is not a simple mirror. It is a layered ruin. In that ruin, blue eyes appear again and again as a faint signal, not proof of identity, not proof of destiny, but proof that one small genetic change passed through the hands of time. It crossed from body to body while cultures vanished around it. It survived in people whose names cannot be spoken because no one recorded them. It moved through graves, forests, farms, and steppes until science much later learned how to read its trace. Blue eyes are often treated as European story, and in frequency that is partly understandable. The trait becomes especially common in parts of northern and eastern Europe, and modern maps make that pattern hard to ignore. But no human trait stays inside a neat border forever. People move, they trade, flee, conquer, marry, sail, settle, are taken captive, return, home, disappear into new languages, and leave descendants in places their ancestors never imagined. Once blue eyes become established in certain populations, they begin to travel beyond their strongest centres, carried not by colour itself but by history. Some of this movement happens slowly and locally. A family crosses a mountain pass. A marriage links two neighbouring valleys. A coastal trader settles far from home. Soldiers remain in a province after a campaign. A child is born in a place where their eye colour is rare, and what had been ordinary in one region becomes striking in another. The evidence remains incomplete for many of these small movements because ordinary families rarely leave clear records. Yet this is how much of human history actually spreads, not through grand events alone, but through countless quiet relocations. In ancient and medieval worlds, blue eyes appear wherever ancestry from light-eyed populations moves and mixes. Germanic migrations, Slavic expansions, Norse voyages, steppe movements, Roman military service, Byzantine frontiers, medieval trade and later colonial expansion all help redistribute visible traits. But these are not clean genetic rivers. They are tangled currents. A person with blue eyes in one region may descend from many possible histories, not one simple source. Their eyes may reflect distant ancestry, recent marriage, local founder effects, or a trait preserved for generations at low frequency. No single explanation fully accounts for every appearance. There is lesser-known caution here. Rare blue eyes outside Europe do not automatically prove a dramatic invasion or hidden ancient colony. Human variation can travel through ordinary contact and eye colour. Inheritance can reappear unexpectedly when recessive variants meet. In some regions of Central Asia, West Asia, North Africa, and South Asia, lighter eyes occur at low frequencies because these regions have long been crossroads of migration and mixture. The old Silk Road world, for example, was not a single road, but a web of oasis towns, caravans, empires, languages, and marriages. Traits moved with merchants, soldiers, pastoralists, slaves, artisans, and refugees. Isolation can also preserve unusual frequencies. On islands in mountain valleys or in small endogamous communities, a trait that is rare elsewhere can become locally more noticeable. This does not require mystery. It requires a founder population, limited marriage, networks, and time. Human groups often preserve genetic quirks simply because they marry within a relatively narrow circle for many generations. Blue eyes can rise or remain visible in such places without any need for legends. Later, European colonial expansion carries blue-eye alleles across the Atlantic into parts of the Americas, Southern Africa, Australia, New Zealand, and other regions. This movement is historically recent and inseparable from violent settlement, enslavement, disease, displacement, and power. The spread of a visible trait in this period cannot be told as a neutral biological journey alone. It travels through empire. It appears in descendants of settlers in mixed communities, in families shaped by coercion as well as choice. The colour itself remains just a mutation, but the roots by which it spreads are often morally heavy. This is another way blue eyes changed humanity, not through the pigment system alone, but through the meanings people attach to ancestry during periods of conquest and hierarchy. In colonial societies, visible traits were often used to classify rank, include, exclude, and control. Eye colour, skin colour, hair texture, and facial features became part of social systems that pretended biology could justify power. Those systems were not ancient truths. They were historical constructions and often brutal ones. The genetic fact of blue eyes does not support them. It only shows how easily visible difference can be recruited into human injustice. At the same time, blue eyes in the wider world also belong to ordinary families, not only empires. They appear in people whose ancestry is mixed across continents, in communities where old boundaries have blurred, in children who inherit a trait from a grandparent several generations back. They can be surprising, but surprise is often just ignorance of how deep and tangled inheritance can be. A visible trait may leap forward after seeming absent because the genetic variants were carried quietly all along. Modern genetics has made this clearer. A person's appearance is not a simple summary of their ancestry. Siblings can look very different. One child may inherit lighter eyes, another darker eyes, while both share the same parents and much of the same ancestry. Populations are statistical patterns, not rules for individuals. This is why using eye colour as a shortcut for origin is unreliable. It can suggest possibilities, but it cannot tell a life story. Blue eyes beyond Europe therefore reveal both movement and misunderstanding. They show that human traits travel farther than stereotypes allow. They also show how easily people mistake a visible feature for a complete identity. A blue-eyed person in Afghanistan, Lebanon, Morocco, India, Argentina, or Vietnam may attract curiosity, but the explanation may be as ordinary as ancestry and inheritance. The mystery is not that the trait exists outside its highest frequency regions. The mystery is how human beings keep demanding simple stories from complex bodies. What survives in the record suggests that every visible trait is a traveller. Skin tones, hair forms, eye colours, blood groups, immune variants, and metabolic adaptations have all moved through human networks. Some movements are prehistoric, some historic, some recent. Some are peaceful, some catastrophic. Blue eyes are one small part of this large emotion. They remind us that no population is sealed forever, and no feature belongs eternally to one place. The mutation that once flickered in an ancient iris now appears in faces across the world, sometimes common, sometimes startlingly rare. It has crossed forest steppes, seas, empires, and oceans. It has been carried by love, hunger, war, trade, exile, ambition, and accident. Its journey beyond Europe is not a separate story from humanity. It is humanity restless, mixed, unequal, inventive, wounded, and always moving. By the time blue eyes enter the modern world, they're no longer just a mutation. They have become memory. Not reliable memory, not complete memory. Not memory that can explain a person's worth or identity, but memory all the same. They carry traces of ancient population history in a form people can see without a laboratory. A blue iris may point faintly toward ancestors who lived through northern forests, farming frontiers, steppe migrations, village expansions and later movements across oceans. Yet the colour does not speak in full sentences. It gives only a clue, and like all clues it can be misread. This is where the story becomes delicate. People often want visible traits to mean more than they can. They want eye colour to reveal origin, character, purity, beauty, intelligence, destiny or belonging. But genetics does not work like folklore. A person with blue eyes is not a living relic of one ancient tribe. They are the result of many ancestral lines crossing and recombining. The mutation may be old, but the person carrying it is not a museum piece. Their genome contains thousands of histories, most of them invisible, and many of them far more important to survival than iris colour. Still, the persistence of blue eyes is astonishing. Think of what had to happen for one regulatory change to remain visible today. Every carrier in the chain had to be born. Enough had to survive infancy infection, hunger, childbirth, violence, migration, and accident. Enough had to find partners and have children. Enough descendants had to pass the variant forward through societies that rose, collapsed, moved, merged, and forgot their own origins. The mutation crossed the end of the Ice Age, the spread of farming, the Bronze Age upheavals, ancient states, medieval kingdoms, plagues, wars, migrations, and modern globalization. It is fragile at the level of one life, but durable at the level of populations. There is a lesser-known irony in this durability. Blue eyes often feel visually dominant because they are striking, but genetically they are not usually dominant in the simple inheritance sense. The trait can hide. It can move quietly through brown-eyed families when the relevant variants are present but not expressed in the expected way. It can reappear generations later, surprising people who think resemblance should obey memory. In that sense, blue eyes are a reminder that ancestry is not always visible. The past can be carried silently until chance makes it seen. Modern science has also made the trait less mysterious and more profound at the same time. Once the HERC2/OCA2 regulatory mechanism is understood, the old supernatural explanations lose their force. Blue eyes are not omens. They are not a separate origin. They are not evidence of ancient visitors, lost master races, or any of the unsupported theories that gather around unusual human features. The biological explanation is clear enough, but knowing the mechanism does not erase wonder. It shifts wonder from fantasy to reality. The real story is not that blue eyes are impossible. The real story is that something so small could travel so far. A mutation becomes memory because humans remember through bodies as well as stories. Families notice eyes before they know genes. A child is told they have their father's eyes, or a grandmother's, or the eyes that appear every few generations. Such remarks are ordinary, but they are also acts of ancestry making. They attach the present body to the dead. They make inheritance emotional. A colour becomes a thread tying living people to people they never met. The science behind it may be molecular, but the experience is intimate. At a population level, blue eyes are also part of how people imagine regional ancestry. In some northern European communities, light eyes become so common that they are folded into local ideas of appearance. In places where they are rare, they become a marker of mixture migration or unusual descent. Both interpretations can be true in limited ways, but both can also become too simple. The evidence remains incomplete whenever visible traits are used as historical maps. Genes can show patterns, but they do not preserve the full human story of language, identity, memory, and belonging. This is especially important because modern history has repeatedly turned appearance into hierarchy. Blue eyes have been idealized in some beauty standards and weaponized in racial fantasies. Those meanings are not natural consequences of the mutation. They are cultural constructions placed on top of it. The mutation itself has no politics. It has no morality. It does not know who carries it. It appears in the eyes of saints and criminals, rulers and labourers, children and elders, people of many cultures and mixed ancestries. It is a biological variation, not a human ranking. What survives in the record suggests that all visible traits are more fluid than ideology wants them to be. Ancient DNA shows unexpected combinations. History shows constant movement. Families show inheritance skipping and returning. The human face is not a flag planted by one pure past. It is a shoreline remade again and again by waves. Blue eyes are one glint on that shoreline. And yet because they are so visible, they continue to attract meaning. They appear in novels, films, paintings, myths, advertisements, family stories, and scientific papers. They can be romanticized as cold, clear, innocent, dangerous, angelic, alien, northern, fragile, piercing, or beautiful. The list says less about the eyes than about the cultures describing them. A blue iris becomes a screen onto which people project longing, fear, and memory. It is one of the strange fates of visible human variation to be both biological fact and cultural mirror. The real legacy of blue eyes is not that they change the course of civilization by themselves. That would be too grand and too false. Their legacy is that they reveal how easily a tiny genetic difference can become entangled with migration, attraction, identity, myth, science, and power. They show how the smallest variations in the body can be carried across deep time and then loaded with meanings far heavier than biology requires. A mutation becomes memory when descendants keep carrying it after the original world has vanished. The forests are not the same forests. The languages are gone. The first families are gone. The campsites are buried, drowned, ploughed, or forgotten. But the light still scatters in the iris of people living thousands of years later. In that scattering is not a complete history, but a trace. And sometimes a trace is enough to remind us that the past is not entirely past. It is looking out from living faces. What blue eyes cannot tell us may be more important than what they can. They can suggest ancestry, but they cannot define it. They can hint at ancient population history, but they cannot reveal language, culture, belief, courage, intelligence, kindness, violence, or worth. They can point toward a small genetic inheritance, but they cannot summarize a human being. This is the final boundary the story must cross because visible traits invite certainty, and certainty is often where history begins to go wrong. A blue iris is a clue, not a conclusion. It may carry the echo of ancient hunter-gatherers, farmers' steppe migrants, local founders' distant marriages, or recent movement across continents. But the same visible colour can arise in people with very different family histories, and people with the same ancestry can inherit different eyes. The evidence remains incomplete whenever appearance is treated as destiny. Human bodies are archives, but they are damaged, partial, and constantly rewritten. The mutation itself is real, its mechanism is real, its deep history is real. But the stories built around it are not always true. Blue eyes are not proof of purity, superiority, or a hidden ancient race. They are not a sign that one group stands outside the shared human story. They are part of that story, one variation among countless others, carried through the same fragile chain of birth and death as every other trait. No single explanation fully accounts for their rise, and no responsible history turns them into a symbol larger than the evidence allows. What survives in the record suggests something quieter and more powerful. A small regulatory change near a pigment gene appears. It survives. It moves through families, forests, farms, steppes, villages, ships, empires, and modern cities. It becomes visible in millions of faces, but it remains only one thread in a vast human weave. The real wonder is not that blue eyes separate people. The real wonder is that they connect the living to vanished worlds without giving those worlds back completely. In the end, blue eyes are strange because they are both intimate and ancient. They are seen across a table in a mirror in a child's face, yet their roots reach into landscapes no one remembers directly. They remind us that the body carries history and fragments, and that even the clearest colour can come from absent scattering and uncertainty. A mutation changed how light returns from the eye, and humanity changed the meaning of that light again and again. The story slows here because the oldest traces do not answer every question. Somewhere behind the modern gaze are people without names, people who never knew they were part of a genetic mystery. They lived by rivers that have changed course, under forests that no longer stand on coasts now buried beneath the sea. They carried children through cold mornings. They watched animals vanish into trees. They buried their dead with hands that could not imagine laboratories' maps of DNA or the long future of their own descendants. From them, almost everything is gone. Their voices are gone. Their songs are gone. Their fears and private tenderness are gone. Their worlds have been broken into bone fragments, stone tools, charcoal pollen teeth, and traces of code hidden in old remains. Yet not everything disappeared. Some part of them continued not as memory in the mind, but as inheritance in the body. Blue eyes are one of those remnants, but only one. Every human face carries similar fragments. Old migrations, old survivals, old accidents that became ordinary. The mistake is to think one visible trait matters more than the whole human being around it. The deeper truth is softer. We're all made of mutations that survived chances that held ancestors who lived long enough for us to exist. So the blue-eyed mutation does not end as a symbol of separation. It ends as a reminder of connection through uncertainty. A tiny change in the dark machinery of inheritance became a colour people noticed, desired, feared, praised, studied, and misunderstood. It crossed time without meaning to. It entered history because humans gave it meaning, and still beneath all the myths the biology remains quiet. Light enters the iris. It meets less pigment than expected. It scatters, returns, and becomes blue in the eye of the observer. For a moment, deep prehistory appears not as a ruin or a skull or a broken tool, but as a living gaze, fragile and luminous, looking back from the present.